Hey, what's up, stock compounders? Brad here. So, number 25 in the Charlie Munger Psychology of Human Misjudgment series, the Lollapalooza Tendency. Okay, our final tendency in this series. So, as always, I'm going to start by reading out of Poor Charlie's Almanac. We're not going to use our favorite AI today, ChatGPT. Wasn't as impressive as some of these articles and blog posts that I found to take us a little bit deeper into Lollapalooza Tendency. So, starting with Poor Charlie's Almanac. Number 25, Lollapalooza Tendency, the tendency to get extreme consequences from confluences of psychological tendencies acting in favor of a particular outcome. This tendency was not in any of the psychology texts I once examined, at least in any coherent fashion, yet it dominates life. It accounts for the extreme result in the Milgram experiment and the extreme success of some cults that have stumbled through practice evolution into bringing pressure from many psychological tendencies to bear at the same time onto conversion targets. The targets vary in susceptibility, like the dogs Pavlov worked with in his old age. But some of the minds that are targeted simply snap into zombiedom under cult pressure. Indeed, that is one cult's name for the conversion phenomenon, snapping. What are we to make of the extreme ignorance of the psychology textbook writers of yesteryear? How could anyone who had taken a freshman course in physics or chemistry not be driven to consider, above all, how psychological tendencies combine and with what effects? Why would anyone think his study of psychology was adequate without having endured the complexity involved in dealing with intertwined psychological tendencies? What could be more ironic than professors using oversimplified notions while studying bad cognitive effects grounded in the mind's tendency to use oversimplified algorithms? I will make a few tentative suggestions. Maybe many of the long-dead professors wanted to create a whole science from one narrow type of repeatable psychology experiment that was conductible in a university setting and that aimed at one psychological tendency at a time. If so, these early psychology professors made a massive error in so restricting their approach to their subject. It would be like physics ignoring one, astrophysics, because it couldn't happen in a physics lab, plus two, all compound effects. What psychological tendencies could account for early psychology professors adopting an over-restricted approach to their own subject matter? One candidate would be availability misweighing tendency, grounded in a preference for easy-to-control data. And then the restrictions would eventually create an extreme case of man with a hammer tendency. Another candidate might be envy-jealousy tendency, through which early psychology professors displayed some weird form of envy of a physics that was misunderstood. And this possibility tends to demonstrate that leaving envy-jealousy out of academic psychology was never a good idea. I now quitclaim all these historical mysteries to my betters. Well, that ends my brief description of psychological tendencies. Okay, so that from Charlie Munger on the Lollapalooza effect. So let's jump into CMQ Investing, their blog post on the Charlie Munger Guide to Lollapalooza. I actually recognize Chris Franco. He might be in my Twitter community, maybe my YouTube community, so shout out to Chris here. So what is a Lollapalooza effect? Right? It's an extreme outcome. Charlie coined the term after studying the three main psychology textbooks He noticed that the famous psychological experiments, like Milgram's experiment about authority bias, failed to consider the other biases at play. I bought the 3 main textbooks for introductory psychology. This was many years ago. And I read through them. And of course, being Charlie Munger, I decided that the psychologists were doing it all wrong, and I could do it better. And one of the ideas that I came up with, which wasn't in any of the books, was that the Lollapalooza effects came when 3 or 4 of the tendencies were operating at once in the same situation. I could see that it wasn't linear. You've got Lollapalooza effects. But the psychology people couldn't do experiments that were 4 or 5 things happening at once because it got too complicated for them and they couldn't publish. So they were ignoring the most important thing in their own profession. Charlie Munger. So what causes Lollapalooza effects? The combination of multiple factors that are all moving in the same direction is what creates the potential for a Lollapalooza effect. The key is that when forces combine, they don't just add up. Each force builds off of and strengthens the other, creating an explosive effect with huge results. Okay, this reminds me of what Peter Kaufman once described as emergent, okay? Emergent forces, like a tornado, for example. You wouldn't expect a tornado if you just look at the inputs, okay? It's this emergent effect. There's one example of Lollapalooza I want to pull from this post, CocaCola. We're going to touch on that a little bit later. The Moonies brainwashing college students. Okay, in his 1997 lecture at the Stanford Law School, an elementary lesson on worldly wisdom revisited, Munger noted that the ability to break people's minds can be the result of a Lollapalooza effect. How do you take a normal kid who is just a little miserable, take him off for a weekend in the country, and turn him into a brainwashed zombie who, for the rest of his life, sells flowers on the street corner? It's obvious. It's a total Lollapalooza. The Moonies achieve it by combining psychological tendencies to act in the same direction. There are about 20 standard tricks that can be used to trigger lousy cognition of that type. And the Moonies have figured out how to play 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them at the same time. They use social proof, they use stress, and the conversion process works to create a snap in a sadly high fraction of cases. Okay. Interesting that this author posits that Kathy Wood, her rapid rise, is actually the result of a Lollapalooza effect. So that's kind of interesting. Let's hop into this Motley Fool article real quick. Definition: Lollapalooza. We humans have many inherent biases and tendencies that can sway our behavior one way or another. When several of them act in concert to drive us toward a particular action, you have a Lollapalooza effect. The Lollapalooza can create large-scale drivers of human behavior and often error. So what does this mean in the real world? Some real-world examples. We've got a positive example and a negative example. Though the Lollapalooza effect is often shown in a bad light, it can have both positive and negative outcomes. One positive example of the Lollapalooza effect is the Alcoholics Anonymous program, which we actually covered in Drug Misinfluence Tendency a few episodes back. AA, which, as Munger explains, boasts a no drinking rate of 50% in cases where all other social and health-related factors fail to motivate alcohol abusers to quit. Munger hails AA as a clever system that makes constructive use of people's psychological tendencies. For example, one reason AA often works is people's natural tendency to imitate those around them. AA members are surrounded by people who have fought to become sober, which makes newer members more likely to follow suit. Right? So that's just one of the tendencies at play in the Alcoholics Anonymous program. On the other hand, Munger also points to the open auction system as a negative example of the Lollapalooza effect. He believes that in this environment, several psychological biases converge, causing people to act foolishly. Namely, the psychological phenomenon known as social proof leads people to imitate the actions of others in an effort to reflect seemingly appropriate behavior. As a result, during an auction, participants will often engage in bidding wars because that's what the people around them are doing, not because they're passionate about acquiring the item up for auction or because they've drawn the logical conclusion that they're offering a good price for the item. Something I think maybe Buffett suggested it. I don't remember when, but he basically said, stay away from auctions, right? They're really terrible for rational decision making. So those are two great examples of Lollapalooza effects, one positive, one negative. We already saw another negative one, the cult kind of Moonies Lollapalooza effect that can snap people into blindly following these cults. This last one, I'm not going to go into. It's fairly long, but this is actually a thought experiment by Charlie Munger on essentially how to turn $2 million into $2 trillion by creating a business that makes use of the Lollapalooza effect. And it's really a case for CocaCola, right? It's looking at CocaCola, unpacking all of these different tendencies that come together to make CocaCola a Lollapalooza, a business that really exhibits the Lollapalooza tendency or Lollapalooza effect. It's a little bit long, so I'll just link it in the description. I highly recommend you guys read this. It's also, I think, an entire chapter in Poor Charlie's Almanac. So well worth digging into and really teasing out the lessons of this incredible business, Coca-Cola. So that's it, guys. That's all I've got. The Lollapalooza effect, number 25. We have made it through all 25 tendencies, psychological tendencies, cognitive biases. So well done. You should all pat yourselves on the back. We're all a little bit smarter now. Of course, this is really just the first step. I'm going to make it part of my life's work to practice all of these tendencies, find examples that are relevant to my life, to really deepen my awareness of how these tendencies are at play in everyday life, so that I can get a little bit closer and closer to rational decision making. Okay, that's really a lifelong pursuit. So with that, thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care.